This week, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to talk about the historical other. Let's get started. Welcome back. I'm Dr. Dwight Turner. This is Being the Other, and this week we're going to talk about the historical other. I want to start though with a quote. The dead are invisible, but not absent. Now that quote comes from Saint Augustine. I can't remember when he said it, or when he's supposed to have said it. And it was used by Dame Hilary Mantel in a series of podcasts, Reith Lectures, not so long ago. And it's actually quite an important quote to actually say that even though people are consigned to history in some way, that they still exist within us, around us, as part of our history. This is very important because this particular cast today looks at why we would tend to rewrite history, why we would tend to write out certain characters or write them in. Another example actually comes from sort of my own culture, which I want to do sometimes on these casts, and it involves the recent unveiling here in London of a statue commemorating the service of Black and Asian servicemen and women during the World Wars I and II. Now what struck me about that is it's taken 60, 70 years for the majority culture here in the UK to fully acknowledge that contribution. The question then becomes, why is that? Now, it's important to recognise just how we view history. Often, when we see it presented on screen, in films, or in books, or even in images, we can tend to rewrite what was actually there. And why would we actually do that? Part of the reason, I think, that we actually go through what I tend to call a form of historical othering, whereby the true history becomes put to one side because it's too difficult for us to sit with, is because of this. It's because we don't like to acknowledge just the reality of what happened. You know, for example, does the majority of the culture like to acknowledge that actually the majority of their forces during World War II, for example, came from the Commonwealth? It wasn't just a war based around a majority versus the Germans. There's the pain of what's taken place. When we look back at it, we may see ourselves as more emancipated, more liberated now in the present. And yet when we look back at the past, it brings up something more difficult for us. It's a bit like if I'm watching a film about slavery, or if somebody's watching a film around the days pre-feminism. Can we actually stay and hold the difficult feelings within us that witnessing the past brings up? In reimagining the past, this is what I think we do, and this is why I think we actually do it. It's in order that we can imagine that we're more emancipated, that we're more powerful, that we were never as weak or as unconscious as depicted in those historical narratives. This is quite important to recognize that in going through that process, we deny ourselves the pain, the process, the difficulties, the anger. We can suppress all sorts of difficult feelings that we don't want to acknowledge by actually reimagining what's gone on before. Pause. Take number 3. So why do we do this? Why do we reimagine the past? Well, part of it is so we can actually take 4. So why do we do this? Why do we reimagine the past? Well, one of the reasons is that we can therefore imagine ourselves as being more powerful than our previous selves, than our historical sort of ancestors. We don't have to acknowledge that actually they're a part of us and we've had to grow up and become more conscious. We can see ourselves as far more emancipated, more powerful, more conscious. Why hold more wisdom? But in doing so, what we're actually unconsciously doing is comparing ourselves, is othering history. It's very important to recognize that. That's why it's quite important to also see that sometimes we have to sit with history as it actually was. and not to denigrate it, hide it, reimagine it in some way. As difficult as it might be, that was the reality. So the dangers of reimagining the past in such a fashion are that we actually don't learn from it. There are messages in there, in our history, that we need to gather and gain. For example, those servicemen and women who weren't acknowledged during World Wars I and II, they hold a huge role for us, for my community, for example, and hold so many messages and lessons that I can learn from. You know, as an ex-serviceman myself, I understand the pressures and pains that those men and women would have been through. I've also already mentioned the second part, which is that we have an implied judgment on the past, that we just weren't good enough, that we're better now than we were then. And that is an unfair comparison. It's a different time, different layer of consciousness. Things change. But we do this over and over again. It shades out historical narratives in a way and gives us a sense of omnipotence over the past, which I think is actually quite dangerous. So that's the third thing I think we need to recognize when we actually other history. So my final point is this. Returning to St. Augustine's quote, what I've tried to do is to turn it around to see it from the perspective of the historical other. And it goes like this. For the historical other, the invisible are truly dead because we, those of us living in the present day, have killed them off. I'm going to leave that one there for this week. Thank you for watching these casts as always. Please keep sending me your notes and so on. It's always a pleasure to hear from yourselves. I look forward to working with you soon. Take care.